Here in part 4 of Why Was the Third Earliest Party in the United States Opposed to Freemasonry, we will introduce arguably the most influential character of the Anti-Masonic Party politically, examples of obstruction of justice on the part of Masons, and a body having washed ashore Lake Ontario. Most likely you've seen parts 1 through 3, and if not, you should do that now and come back here later. Look for the links at the top of this page or in the description box below. If you've already seen 1 through 3, welcome back to my channel where I question history as we know it. I hope you enjoy the show, and if you do, you know what to do. And now, allow me to introduce Mr. Thurlow Weed. In his autobiography, Weed writes that he was the editor of a small paper in Rochester when he was approached in the summer of 1826 about publishing Morgan's book, but he had refused the offer based on the fact that his business partner at the time was a Mason. He states that he didn't think about it again until September, when the initial meeting was held in Batavia regarding Morgan's abduction. After reading the proceedings of this meeting, he wrote a 6-line paragraph outlining Morgan's disappearance, acknowledging that Freemasons were involved, and suggested that it would be wise for the fraternity, whose good name was suffering, to assist in returning Morgan his freedom. This and other comments upset many influential members of the community, who immediately withdrew their subscriptions or advertisement. When asked why this had caused so much excitement among their friends, his partner showed him a book describing the oath that comes with serious punishments for sharing the secrets of the Masons. Then he asked Weed what he thought about someone who, after making such a commitment, goes ahead and breaks it. Thurlow admits that at that time he stated that someone deserved the fate of whatever he had promised. But after having joined the Rochester Investigation Committee in his hometown, and then later the Central Committee, otherwise known as the Lewiston Committee, Thurlow, along with the other members, had become convinced that Morgan was murdered, and believed that the Masonic Order should disavow the crime and assist in bringing the guilty parties to justice. Since most businessmen at that time were Masons, it became apparent that the newspaper would be ruined if he stayed, and so Weed decided to leave the paper in his partner's hands. He claims he was unable to find work with other newspapers in the surrounding area, with the reason given being all the comments he had made about Morgan and the Masons. He says this proved to be embarrassing for him, and in desperate need to provide for his family, he started a new paper entitled The Anti-Masonic Inquirer. It was through this paper that Thurlow detailed the Morgan Committee's findings to the public, which helped keep the whole affair in the news. Other anti-Masonic newspapers began popping up, and it became commonplace to find 5 to 6 columns about the Morgan Committee's findings in papers all across the counties the troop had passed through on their way to Fort Niagara. The people craved the truth and justice. It was true that Masons held a disproportionate number of government positions in New York during 1826. And at least 5 of the key figures in the whole affair were government officials, those being Sheriff William R. Thompson, Sheriff Eli Bruce, Constable Dana H. Dana, Constable Holloway Hayward, and Constable Jesse French. It was known that Morgan was taken across county lines by means of a government-issued warrant, and held presumably against his will in a government-owned building. The anti-Masons were convinced that Freemasons had taken the law into their own hands, and as the trials on the Morgan kidnapping continued, they became more and more convinced that the Masons were purposefully obstructing justice. For example, in the trial of Masons Holloway Hayward, James Ganson, Harris Seymour, Henry Howard, and Moses Roberts in August of 1827, proof existed that all of these men, except for Ganson, had gone with Nicholas Chesborough to Batavia to arrest Morgan and bring him to Canandaigua, aiding him on the way. However, Chesborough testified that none of the men were informed by him, nor had any knowledge of a plan for after they reached Canandaigua. This testimony produced their acquittal. At the same court, Masons Chauncey Coe, Hiram Hubbard, and James Lackey were tried and also acquitted. Lackey's role had been in obtaining the arrest warrant for Morgan. Coe had secured Hubbard's horses and carriage that had been used to escort Morgan away, while Hubbard himself was the driver. But in this case, it could not be proved that they had prior knowledge of the intended use of the carriage, and so they were acquitted. Another example was that of Sheriff Eli Bruce of Niagara County, who had been arrested immediately when it became known to the committees that he had been accompanying the carriage holding William Morgan as they passed through his county. At the time, the law gave the sheriff's power to assemble grand juries and select jurors. At Sheriff Bruce's request, Deputy Sheriff and Royal Arch Mason Hiram Hopkins assembled a jury of mostly Masons or friends of Masons in Niagara County in April of 1827 to hear the complaint made against Sheriff Bruce. Because of this, strange things happened. In one instance, The jury decided by a large majority that a witness did not have to answer a question asked of him on the grounds that he, quote, was a poor man who got his living by labor, and that if he should testify, it might prove a serious injury to himself and his family. Okay, pause for a second. What? Why would it cause injury to himself and his family if he testified, aka told the truth? Is it because he was involved and they're trying to protect him? Or are they trying to protect themselves? I'll let you decide. Comment below. Let me know what you think. Okay, back to it. When one of the jurors insisted that the witness should answer, the witness did tell what he knew, which essentially was that Bruce had been involved in carrying Morgan to Niagara. But directly after this testimony, other witnesses were introduced and examined to challenge the credibility of the last-named witness. Even though this grand jury had been called to investigate Bruce, the Masonic foreman was, quote, seen to leave the jury room and retire to a private room with Bruce, and there remained for a considerable time. Pause again. Obviously, something's going on here. It doesn't take a smart person to recognize this, in my opinion. I digress. Back to the story. Bruce was acquitted, of course, since it could not be proven that anyone was kidnapped or that any force or violence had been used on any person in the carriage. Dissatisfied with this result, a complaint was made again to Governor Clinton, and after Bruce's reply to the governor's questions, he was removed from his position and set for trial in September of 1828. At this point, the Lewiston Committee had been persistent for many months, and they had assisted in changing the laws based on these events. Kidnapping was made a felony in New York, punishable from 3 to 14 years. Sheriffs were no longer allowed the power to summon grand juries, and now town supervisors were authorized to prepare lists of prospective jurors. The committee has found that in some cases, like that of Niagara County, the jurors were made up of Masons and they would not find any indictments. Or, in others, the jury was unable to secure direct testimony from witnesses, effectively stonewalling the process. As the facts continue to be published through anti-Masonic newspapers, the meetings that were once held became conventions. And what was once a more religious fervor was turning political, as the people resolved to, quote, withdraw their support at elections from all such men of the Masonic fraternity. Since many Masons were prominent businessmen, bankers, judges, and politicians, this could also be considered a form of anti-elitism. By autumn, it was clear that anti-Masonry had attracted a spirited and uneasy mixed group, comprising of some ethical idealists, those who wished to remake society through the party, those who wished for minimal political participation only until Masonry itself had been abolished, and also some being political realists, like Weed, who saw this as a way to establish a permanent political party to amass support for elections and administer the political benefits. In his autobiography, Weed insists that neither he or the others on the committee had any intention of entering the political sphere until one of the members of the committee, Dr. F. Backus, who had been the treasurer of Rochester since it had been chartered, and who was thought to have been running unopposed, lost suddenly to a write-in candidate, Dr. John Elwood, who happened to be a Mason. It was after this moment, Weed says, anti-Masonry began to move into politics. However it happened, it was the Lewiston Committee members and Weed, having organized town meetings and county conventions in previous years for Clinton's People's Party, who helped direct this transition. It was during this time that the focus on eliminating a privileged class and winning elections quickly became more important than seeking punishment for those responsible for the Morgan abduction among the New York anti-Masons. In October of 1827, over a year after Morgan's abduction and on the eve of an election, a body washes up on the shore of Lake Ontario. The coroner's inquest ruled the cause of death as accidental drowning. The body was in such a putrid state that it was buried where it was found. Once this inquest had been published, excitement arose within the anti-Masonic community that this body could possibly be that of William Morgan. And so the body was disinterred and examined. Accounts on this are confusing and awkward. One such account states that the height, clothes, and the papers in his pockets were all different from that of Morgan. Another claims that Mrs. Morgan and the others match a scar on the foot and specific missing and broken teeth as the same as Morgan. Nonetheless, another inquest is held. Lucinda claims the body to be that of her husband, and the jury agrees. The body is buried as Morgan, complete with a funeral and procession, and add a dash of extra for the papers, of course. A short time later, however, a widow and her son appeared, claiming that the body was that of their husband and father, Timothy Monroe. He had drowned in September after his boat had capsized in the Niagara River. So again, an inquest was held, the body disinterred, and this time, jurors agreed that the body was that of Mr. Monroe. Weed, who had helped arrange the second inquest with Morgan's friends and family, was politically smeared after this incident. He was quoted in a Masonic paper as stating that the body was a good enough Morgan until after the election. It could be seen that Thurlow and others used all of the attention of the body merely for campaign purposes. I find this part of the story particularly gross, but I'm definitely leaning towards Weed deserved the smearing. Because, to be fair, it was stated in several accounts that the Lewiston Committee spent money dragging the lake several times. Another account stating that there were specific instruments created for just this purpose. They really wanted a body, so a body they got. This concludes part 4 of Why Was the Third Earliest Party in the United States Opposed to Freemasonry? If you're enjoying this, please remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you'd like to support my channel further, check out the links in the description box below. Part 5 up next.